Hello, everybody. Today we will be discussing chordates. And chordates encompasses a very wide variety of animals. And technically, the whole rest of our first semester is going to focus on chordates. Um, so let's jump into it here. The name chordata comes from the presence of a structure called a notochord. And a notochord is a stiff rod that supports the central axis of the animal. In some, that's replaced by a vertebrate, like your spinal cord. Okay. Um, Other characteristics that chordates have, they have a dorsal tubular nerve cord. Um, think of that as the actual nerve cord that runs up and down your body, like the spinal cord. The notochord, like I said, is a stiff rod that supports the central axis of the animal, like your vertebrae. Next traits are pharyngeal slits. Slits in the pharyngeal cavity to the outside. In most terrestrial animals, those close up during early development, but in aquatic animals, those form gills. There's an endostyle, also known as the thyroid gland in your body, which is an organ used to release hormones and control metabolism. Then a post-anal tail is the final trait. So dorsal tubular nerve cord, a notochord, pharyngeal slits, endostyle, and a post-anal tail. 5 hallmark characteristics of chordates. And you can see them all here in this organism here. So if we look, here's the mouth. Here are pharyngeal slits. That's one trait. Here's the anus. Here's a tail. So that's a post-anal tail. 2. Hollow nerve cord. 3. Um, let's see. A notochord is 4. And then 5 would be the endostyle, which you can't see in this picture. Okay. We can see here's what a notochord looks like. Sometimes it's surrounded by different layers for protection. Here's an elastic sheath and a fibrous sheath. This provides flexibility. This supplies support. Other traits that chordates have, they're bilaterally symmetrical. They are coelomates. They possess metamerism. They're cephalization, so collection of nerves in the head, and they are deuterostomes. These are the first animal groups that we're talking about that are deuterostomes. And then here is basically the wide variety of animals we're going to study second semester, from very, very simple chordates like tunicates and lanceolets to all of the fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. So traditionally, chordates are split into 2 main groups, protochordata and vertebrata. Protochordata are animals with no skull. Those are things like tunicates and sea squirts and lanceolets. The subphylums that make those up are called Urochordata and Cephalochordata. And then the other group are the vertebrata, which have a skull. And the vertebrata are split up into agnatha, which are the jawless animals, and gnathostomata, which have jaws. And then gnathostomata can split up into pisces, which are things with fins, and then tetrapods with usually 2 pairs of limbs. Don't worry about the classifications here and how they divide. We will draw a diagram to kind of connect all of this later, okay? And you can just see here how they're all divided and how their traits divide them in this cladogram here. So let's jump into some of the very basic chordates. Future units will tackle each one of the major groups of chordates like fish, amphibians, and reptiles. But for these notes, we're just going to go into the less well-known chordates. So starting with Urochordata, which are tunicates and sea squirts. They occur in all seas and at all depths all over the world. In most species, only the larval form has all of the hallmark characteristics, and adults lose many of those characteristics when they develop. And so during their adult metamorphosis, the notochord and the tail disappear, and the nerve cord is severely reduced. Here's an example of an adult tunicate colony. It almost looks like a sponge if you look really quickly. but we see that it does have some of the similar traits as chordates. So it has a siphon similar to what you'd see in a clam, but inside there are these pharyngeal slits which turn into gills. They actually do have a heart, reproductive organs, stomach, intestine, things like that. But if you look at the larval stage, that's this one over here, it has all 5 characteristics. So a tail, the notochord, the nerve cord, the pharyngeal slits here, and then again, you can usually not see the endostyle because it's a small organ. And in this slide, we can actually see the endostyle and the pharyngeal slits, which are the only remaining characteristics in the adult tunicate. Here is a sea squirt, another member of this species as well. Then let's talk about Cephalochordata, which is the other member of this division here. And that includes animals known as lancelets or amphioxus. They are slender, laterally flattened, translucent animals, about 5 to 7 centimeters long, with no skull. And that's the key characteristics. If you look at the picture, which I'll show you in a second, they basically look like fish without a face. Generally, they live in the sandy bottoms of coastal waters all around the world. And there are about 25 different species that we have described, and only about 5 live in the North American coastal waters. Here is what they look like here. Again, like I said, it kind of looks like a fish without a face. But we can see all of the 5 characteristics here. So dorsal nerve cord, notochord, pharyngeal splits, endostyle, and postnatal tail. And then here's just a couple more pictures and a diagram where you can see what the amphioxus looks like. So one of the key things and themes that we'll talk about when we bring up chordates is the evolution of different groups of chordates. We know that some of the earliest vertebrates, so chordates that have a head and have a spinal column, were these armored jawless fish, where their bodies were protected by these large armored plates, but they didn't have a jaw. And when we get to our fish, you'll see how that can be when we talk about modern jawless fish, like hagfish and lamprey. Next thing I want to bring up is the formation of the jaw and how that could have potentially come, right? How do you develop a jaw from jawless fish? Well, jawless fish still had gill slits and little supporting rods to support those gills. And what we think happened over time, and there is some evidence to back this up in the fossil record, is that some of the first few gill arches here eventually develop into what we know as the jaw and the muscles that support it. And we can see it here, right? So here's one of the earliest gill arches. Over time, it enlarges and forms the jaws here. And we can see the jaws here, which is a huge evolutionary breakthrough, because without jaws, animals could not chew their food. And that cuts off a large percentage of available food. And so the presence of these jaws is a big evolutionary mechanism. And so we see the jaws here, and these second gill arches turn into the muscles that support the jaw. And we can see it here. Here's a modern shark structure here of their jaw, where we can see this is where the teeth would be in the first jaw here. And then here is cartilage and muscle that supports it. The rest of the vertebrates, again, are going to have their own units, but here's some divisions, right? And so Agnatha is a class that doesn't have jaws. Those include hagfish and lamprey. The fish are made up of chondrochythes and osteocythes. Those are for cartilaginous fish and bony fish. And then when we get to the vertebrates, or sorry, the tetrapods, when we get to the tetrapods, we'll bring up amphibians, birds, reptiles, and mammals. And just some interesting statistics here. So chordates, most of the chordate species we know in the world are actually fish. We can see that here, 48% 9% of all chordates are fish, 9% amphibians, 13% reptiles, 17% birds, and 8% mammals. And we can see that in just relative numbers here as well, right? So there's 25,000 different types of ray-finned fish. If you compare that to mammals, there's only about 4,500 different species. So thank you for watching. That was our introduction into chordates. Again, we will go more in depth into chordates in future units.